Alright, so we know what Lie algebras are and we know how to write the Jacobi identity. So let's write it down. Lie algebra L, and the Jacobi identity says that so this is the first order. Lie algebra L, various words. Just writing down the words that we saw yesterday: representations, homomorphisms, ideals, quotients, all that kind of stuff. Then we saw what nilpotent, Lie algebras meant, and today we will get to start actually doing mathematics. So let's recall the Jacobi identity. And the Jacobi identity says the following. So if I have x, which is an element of the Lie algebra, then I define this operator dx, right, which is from L to L, which takes any y and sends it to bracket, right. And so the Jacobi identity says that this operator is a derivation, correct. So I will just change the notation slightly. Instead of d for derivation, I will call this add x. Right. So add x of y is that. And now I get to think of add as a map from L. It takes an element x and sends it to add x. Well, what kind of object is add x? It's also a map from L to L. So for each element of L, I get an operator on L, and because of linearity in all the arguments, add x is linear and this is also linear, but it's more than that, right, that this is actually going to be a representation. So let's just check that. So this is a representation of L. So what has to be checked? So I know that add x is a derivation, but here I have to check something else, right? What do I have to check here? Correct. So when I take the bracket of that this preserves that the map add preserves brackets, that is to say the bracket of add, when I take add of the bracket of x and y, it's the same as the bracket of add x and add y. This bracket is some kind of abstract bracket, right, whereas this bracket actually means the composition add x add y minus add y add x. It's actually happening in, right. So this is a check, and I think maybe you can just do it on your own. Shall we do it, or I think, yeah, I'll just leave it. So you can check this. So this is a God given representation that comes with any Lie algebra, and it's a very important representation. And I should also say that this comes from, if the Lie algebra L is the Lie algebra of a group G, an algebraic group or a Lie group, then there is a representation of G from which this comes, and the way this happens is that G also has an action on the Lie algebra of L. This action is the adjoint action, where the A is written as big. And now when you take the derivative of this map, you go to tangent spaces on both sides, and here you get L. The tangent space to the group GL at identity is the Lie algebra GL. and the derivative of the map big add is the small add. So, it actually comes from something, and the map big add comes in a way from conjugation. So, right. Yeah, let us recall the definitions of these various things, nilpotent, solvable, and so how did we define a nilpotent Lie algebra? So, again you can remind me about the notation. L is solvable means if I take its derived series 0 eventually, and L is nilpotent means that eventually, and where do I put the here, the top one, this is the notation, okay. But in any case, more than the notation, let us recall what this means. It means I take the commutator of L with itself, then I take the commutator of what I get with that thing itself, and so on, whereas here the commutator is always taken with L itself as at each stage. And so, if you say that something is nilpotent, it is a much stronger thing, it is harder for something to be nilpotent. So, examples. So, certainly the trivial examples are abelian Lie algebras are like this, but more typical examples. So, the upper triangular matrices, let me use K, and here the strictly upper triangular matrices, K is the size and F is the field, remember. But also the diagonal ones, right. So, at this point I would like to make a small calculation here. What is that? If I take the commutator of, so recall what this means. It means you take everything in here with everything in here, you take the commutators and you take the linear span. That is the general notation. So, what is this? If I take an arbitrary upper triangular matrix, if I take two upper triangular matrices and calculate their commutator, what do I get? Because the diagonal entries, the multiplication is simply the product of respective diagonal entries. So, when I subtract, it cancels out, right. So, what this shows is that, but actually by explicit calculation you can get every single strictly upper triangular matrix in this fashion. You just have to do the appropriate calculation with matrix units, right. So, this is equal. So, check. And here also I have to say check. So, let us just look at one of these, namely this example. To see that this is nilpotent, what would I have to do? I would have to keep taking the commutator of this with itself, and then every result I have to take the commutator with this. What will happen? So, if you have not done this calculation, you should actually sit down and do it. That the matrices that you get, they keep becoming 0 and 0 further and further away from the diagonal. So, then the super diagonal becomes 0, and then so on, right. What happens over here when you check that this is solvable? Something similar happens, but even more so at a faster pace. So, those calculations you should do. Okay, and then we saw some simple things about this, that both of these properties pass to Lie subalgebras, simply because if something is smaller, then the entire derived series or the lower central series will be contained in the one of the bigger one. They also pass to quotients, because the respective series of a quotient is just the quotient of the well, whatever, we complete that sentence. And then for the solvable one, I had this interesting thing that if I is recall, if I is solvable, a solvable ideal, and L mod I solvable, implies L is solvable. So I just asked a question: is the same thing true about nilpotency? Example. Sorry. Well, I mean, something is written right there which, right, so see, this is an ideal here, right? You can just, because it's the bracket of these two, this is an ideal. When you go modulo this, you are going to get the diagonal ones, and both of those are nilpotent, but it's a check that, I mean, that this is not going to be, that T is not going to be nilpotent. And in fact, can you see why? When you derive, you get N. But now when you keep taking the, but then that's it, it's not going to go any further down. When you take the bracket of that with T, you are going to stay there. So these examples are typical in the sense of two theorems that we will prove. So before that, do I need any more preparation? Okay. So recall. And well, this is not recall, it's really note. So if L mod is that clear? Let's just look what this means. If L mod its center, if that is nilpotent, what it means is that if you keep bracketing with this, you are eventually 0. When you pull that statement back up to L, what does it mean? That if you keep bracketing with L, you will eventually fall in the center. So you hit it once more and it's going to be 0. So that's all right. Similarly, L is nilpotent implies, just using the same thing, I should say this is non-zero etc. So if something is a, if you have a nilpotent Lie algebra, then its center is, well, where do you look for this center to get? So where you get 0, if you just look at the step before that, you will have something non-zero which when bracketed with L is 0. So that part is definitely in the center. But actually more is true. In fact, every non-zero ideal of L intersects For this we will need Engel's theorem. So Engel's theorem says that it connects two meanings of the word nilpotent. In the absence of this, a nilpotent endomorphism of a vector space is something whose some power vanishes, right? So what it says is that if a Lie algebra acts by nilpotent endomorphisms on a vector space, then you can essentially make it nilpotent, but we will do something much better. So if L acts on V, always finite dimensional unless otherwise stated. But here we do not need any restriction on the field. The field may have any characteristic and it need not be algebraically closed, because it acts on V by nilpotent endomorphisms. Is the meaning of this clear? That means that is to say, there is this map phi, right? So what this means is that every phi of x is a nilpotent operator, is nilpotent on V, just for all x in L. So since the operator is nilpotent, if I pick one of them, it will always have an eigenvector, right? Just see the place before which just see the power before which it dies, and you will always get. So this is the reason why we don't need the field to be algebraically closed, because you always have an eigenvector. The point is, each x may have a different eigenvector, but I can find a common one, an eigenvector that will work for all of them. That's the content of the theorem. Then there exists V not equal to 0 such that LV is 0, which is to say x times V is 0 for all x in L. So how do I find out such a thing? Okay, let's first reel off the corollaries of this. Various corollaries. So one is there exists a basis of V for which all matrices of relative to which I should say all matrices of L. By all, I made a little misleading statement here in which I said L becomes upper triangular, but I don't really have L the way I have stated this. L is simply acting on V. So the Lie algebra that actually becomes upper triangular is the image, is the phi of L. So when I say matrices of L, I always mean phi of x are strictly upper triangular. And is this clear how to do? You just keep doing it again and again. You first find your common eigenvector, then you go modulo that. The idea is that the action on that, there is an induced action, right? Because since it's a common eigenvector, the linear span of that line is stable. So you can take the quotient. The action on the resulting thing is still nilpotent. So you can find something killed by it, but killed in that quotient space actually means that in the upper space, the second thing, when you act x on that, you will get 0 plus something in the span of the first one, and so on and so forth. So this is all right. Second one is okay, we have to do this too, but let me just stick to my notes. Second one actually deduces nilpotency of L, provided the add, by applying this to the add action. So apply this to the add. So what does this say? If each x in L is add nilpotent, this is the terminology of the book, but all that it means is that is to say each add x is a nilpotent operator on L. Right. So here is L itself. Okay, then what happens? Let's just see. Let's apply this theorem. What does it say? So there is some vector v in the vector space which is L, right, in which is killed by all of L. But what is this LV? That is really add means it's the bracket action, correct? So what this does for me is that there is a center, right? So then there is a center, okay. Okay, but then let's take this a little bit forward. So if there is a center, then what happens? There is that Z of L. I can go modulo that is lower dimension, right? And you look at that L mod Z of L, let's call it L prime. Now you see that L prime, when that acts on itself by adjoint action, it's going to satisfy the same property, because L acts on itself in a nilpotent fashion. When you take a quotient, the same property is going to be true. What does there is absolutely no mystery. What is the meaning of add x being nilpotent? That simply means when I bracket with x and then I bracket with x and then I bracket with x, eventually I get 0. Well, I can put bars everywhere, right? So the property that add of x is 0, that will just pass to quotients. So I'll just write this. I mean, I have not stated my conclusion yet, but we will just be sort of forced to it. Proof by Engel Z of L is not equal to 0. L mod Z of L has the same property, and so by induction I can say that it is nilpotent. That's what I am going to say. Then L is I have come some dimension down where the same property is true, so I get to say that this is nilpotent. I should start off my induction, right? But you see that in dimension 1 there is, it's all right. So L mod Z of L is nilpotent, and then, I mean, this is a little stupid, no, the way I am saying it. Instead of nilpotent, I get to say any property, but then it has to connect up. I have to deduce that property for L, and that is where my little observation here comes in, right? That if L mod Z of L is nilpotent, then L is nilpotent. So I can complete the induction. Otherwise, it was stupid. I mean, I could write any property here. Therefore, L is nilpotent. So I have a nice criterion for L to be nilpotent, and I will later on connect this whole business with solvability too, which will feed into something very nice. So L is nilpotent, provided, notice that the other way is, I mean, what is the content of this? Look at the converse of this statement, that if L is nilpotent, then every element of X acts nilpotently by the adjoint action. Is that true? Let's look at the definition of nilpotency, right? That means you keep bracketing by L, and eventually it becomes 0. So when I keep bracketing, I could choose the same element again and again. So what does that mean? That means L, 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 L in a finite number of steps. So I could choose the particular case where I take x, x, x everywhere, and that will say that the operator add x is a nilpotent operator. So this is a particular consequence of nilpotency. What that is saying is the interesting direction, that actually the converse is true. That if all add x are nilpotent operators, then the Lie algebra is nilpotent. And let's look at this last one, 3. So is this clear? Every non-zero ideal of L, let's call it something I, intersects Z of L. So I claim that also just falls out of it. How? I have to look at the action of something on something. Remember, L is already given to be nilpotent. So, in particular, which action am I going to look at? Remember, the action has to be nilpotent. So, which action shall I look at? Add action of what on what? See, I want to locate something or the other where? In I. So, I should look at the action on I. I is an ideal. So, it is all right when I take the adjoint action of L, it does act on I actually, because it is an ideal. The action is nilpotent, and so you go the same route as before. Okay. So, there is a and so the theorem tells me that there is a non-zero eigenvector which is killed by this add action, but that is exactly what I want, right. So, let us prove this. And again I do induction. So, if I want to do induction on L, which is the dimension of L, and since I am doing induction on dimension, I immediately get to assume that this map phi is, see, I am doing induction. So, for smaller dimension I am allowed to assume it. So, look, I mean notice that really L does not matter here, right. What matters is the image. So, if the dimension goes down, then I can just appeal to induction. So, I get to assume that this phi is actually an injective map, and that is how the theorem is stated in the book. So, induction, so can assume phi is 1 to 1, which is to say that L is actually sits inside, by identifying with the image, that L sits inside this. I can assume. Okay. So, since I want to apply induction, I want to find out something within it which is as large as possible, to which I look, I want a common eigenvector, right. Everything in L should kill this. So, if I find a large Lie subalgebra in there, it is a Lie subalgebra, and since everything in L acts nilpotently, everything in the smaller thing will also act nilpotently. So, I can apply induction to it, right. And while I am applying induction, I should try to find as large a subalgebra as I can, so that most of the work is done, and then I have to find only the one that is only for whatever is left over, right. Is the strategy clear? So, in fact, what I will do is I will find something which is as large as possible without being the whole thing. Now, I want to use induction. So, the Lie algebra that I will find will be of codimension 1. Okay. And moreover, what will be the, okay, let's see where we. So, will find. How? That is the interesting part actually. So, will find K L of codimension 1 and apply inductive hypothesis. So, in particular, so what it is we will see, but it is going to be a linear subspace nonetheless. So, in fact, I can write L equals let us take the same notation, F times Z. This plus is only as vector spaces. So, there is K, which is a codimension 1 subspace, and then I add any vector which is not in it, and I will get the whole thing. F is, remember, the field, right. So, I will say as vector spaces, that everything in K has a common eigenvector. Right. So, by induction, okay, let me put anyway a Lie subalgebra, and then we will see that we will need to modify this. By induction, there exists common, or there exists V such that K times V equal to 0 and V is not equal to 0. You recall the proofs that we remembered from linear algebra yesterday. If you want to find common eigenvectors of several operators, what is the general idea? You take common eigenvectors of something, and what you get an eigenvector of some of the operators, it need not be an eigenvector of other operators, but then you take the space of all such, and then you hope to show that the space of all common eigenvectors of a subset of operators is actually invariant under the remaining operators. So, then you can take the eigenvector of the remaining operator on that space. Okay. So, we are going to try to do the exact same strategy here and even for Lee's theorem. Okay. So, let W equals V such that K V equal to 0, and all I know is that this is a non-zero space. So, what we would hope to show is that this W is invariant under Z. Okay. Now, notice one thing, the action is linear, right. This is a simple point, but probably should be made sometime. If you have a common eigenvector for all the operators here, and among them if I find an eigenvector for Z, it is an eigenvector for everything else. You see, because the action is linear. So, if some y is in K and y times V is some lambda V, and this extra Z is there, Z times V is some mu V, then I also know that y plus Z times V is, that is because this map is also a linear map, right. So, even though there are lots and lots of operators, really if you want to find a common eigenvector, it is enough to do for a basis. So, all I have to do is to try to find an eigenvector of Z on this space W. Okay. But it is enough to show that this space W is stable under Z, because as soon as the space is stable, it is a nilpotent operator, right. It is a nilpotent operator on the big space, it eventually dies. So, even on the subspace it will die, and so it will have an eigenvector. So, all that I need to do is to show that W is stable, and for that calculation we will, let us see what we are led to. We will be led to a wish, and then we will have to see how to fulfill that wish. So, remember, I still have not defined K, right. This is really in some sense happening in empty space. So, I have to see what Z, if I take a vector, I will take V in W. Is W stable under Z, right. So, I have to check if, but how do I check that? I apply, so take y in K and look at y Z acting on V. What is this y Z? This is just composition of operators. These are actual matrices now acting on. So, y Z B, and then what do we do? I mean, sort of it suggests itself, right, there is a Lie algebra. So, this is Z y V, and then I have to add this and subtract this. So, that is plus the commutator of because it is a Lie algebra representation, right. So, the abstract bracket in L on the right hand side becomes the actual bracket y z minus z y. Okay, so, what can I say here? Zero, right. So, in order for this in order for this strategy to work, what must happen? What must I be able to prove? Well, I mean that this is 0, it is not forced, but it would be nice if this thing would also, if this thing were also to belong to K, then since V is a common eigenvector for K, I would be done. In other words, we should wish not only that K is a Lie subalgebra, but K is actually an ideal. Remember, Y is in K and I am bracketing it with Z, which is outside it. If it falls back in K, then it would be good, right. So, we will find an ideal of So this was the nice and easy part, but the real thing is how to do that. Because once I do that, then it's done, right? You see the proof is finished then. Because if that is the case, then this is 0 plus 0, which is 0, which shows that if I take y in k, then I mean if I take v in w, then z times v is also in w, and so then you can take an eigenvector of z on that. Okay. So how do I do this? And I simply do the following: take define k to be the following. Oh, how are we doing? K to be a maximal Lie subalgebra. That is okay, right? It is a finite dimensional Lie algebra. So I just take something which is proper. And I claim that this actually does the job. It must have codimension 1 and it must be an ideal. So why is that? Let us see. I can take the okay, but how do I do that? Bracket LL is proper. Why is that? Why is that? Yes. But that game will work when we go to Lie's theorem. But see, the nilpotency that I want to prove here is, I mean, I have not given that L is nilpotent. All I know is that individual operators are nilpotent, right? But you are right. I mean, this is a good idea to keep in mind, because we will be able to use that when it comes to proving Lie's theorem. But here I don't know anything about L as a Lie algebra as far as those properties are concerned. In some sense, that's what I am trying to prove. Okay. So what we will do is we will use induction here. Let's try to find an appropriate action on something on a space of a smaller dimension. So recall that I am assuming that L sits inside GLV. So I will try to look for the action of K on something or the other. Remember, K, I want it to be an ideal. In other words, the bracket of K with L should sit inside K. In other words, if I take the adjoint action of K on L mod K, what should it be? Trivial, right? Because the bracket of K with L should be inside K, so which means if I go modulo K, it should be 0. And that is exactly the kind of thing that this theorem is giving me, right? It's giving me that some vector which is skilled. So let us look at K acts by add on L. That is, I mean, because L acts on L by add, it also acts on K by add because it is a subalgebra, and therefore this action passes down to an action on L mod K, correct? I want to show that this action is nilpotent, right? Now we will see in a moment why this action is nilpotent. Action of, in fact, all these actions are nilpotent. Nilpotently. Are you allowed to say nilpotently? I don't know, anyway, I just said it. So all these actions are nilpotent. This is something that we have to check, all right. But this is a small and nice calculation which occurs in several places. It's just a little algebraic thing. But let us assume this for a moment. So why? I will just say that, why, in a moment. Notice that if I just show that K acts on L nilpotently, then it's done, right, because I am just passing to the quotient. That quotient operator will also be a nilpotent operator. So I just have to check that. We will just check that in a moment. But if it does, then if k acts on L mod k in a nilpotent fashion, then what does that mean? Therefore, there exists something which I will helpfully call Z bar in L mod k, which is killed by the adjoint action of k, right, such that add k acting on Z bar is 0 in L mod k. But what does that mean? That means if I take the bracket of k with Z bar, this is a bad thing to write. Let me just pull up Z bar to something Z in L, but something being 0 in L mod k simply means that k bracket with Z lies in k. Notice what this means. So consider now k plus the line spanned by Z. Okay, what about this? This is certainly a subspace, this is certainly a vector space of dimension 1 bigger than k. What is this? Is this a Lie algebra in itself? Let us check. Well, k is a Lie subalgebra, so that is all right. If I take the bracket of Z with itself, it is 0. So I just have to check the cross brackets. If I take the bracket of something in k with Z, it lands in k. So this is a Lie subalgebra. But I started at which is strictly bigger than k. So it has to be all of L, and not only that, within L now k is an ideal, because k, the only thing that could make it fall out is bracket by Z, but that also goes in there, right. So this neat thing here finishes the proof modulo this little fact here, right. So why does k act on L in a nilpotent fashion? This is a special case of something which is much more general. Let us say if x is in GLV, fact. I will say nilpotent matrix. Then add x is also nilpotent. So where does add x sit? It sits inside end of GLV, right. So if you have a nilpotent operator on V, when I bracket by that operation is a nilpotent operation on the space of matrices. Okay. This actually does the job, because remember k and L, they are both sitting inside GLV, right. So if I take something inside k, it acts on V in a nilpotent fashion. So it will act on GLV in a nilpotent fashion, and all these are subalgebras, right, they are stable. So if some operator is nilpotent on a whole space, and if some space is stable under it, it will of course be nilpotent even on that space. So it is really this general fact here, right. Is this okay, that how this finishes that off? It's okay. All right. So take an operator in k and let us call that x. It is in GLV, right. It actually sits inside GLV. That is why I wanted to have it both ways here. Sits inside GLV. So it acts on V in a nilpotent fashion. Therefore, it acts on GLV in a nilpotent fashion by the fact that I am still yet to prove. But the adjoint action, under this adjoint action, because this my operator sits inside k, and k is a Lie algebra, right, and in fact it sits inside L, which is also a Lie algebra. So under the adjoint action of x, L is stable. On the whole space it is a nilpotent operator. So already on any stable subspace it is going to be a nilpotent operator. So it is nilpotent on L, it is nilpotent on k, and of course it is nilpotent then on the quotient. So the general operating fact is this, which is, let's just see why this is the case, right. So what I want to say is that if I take add x to the some large power n of y, that is 0, right. So for n large. And then of course I know that which n will work, right? If something is nilpotent, the dimension of the vector, anyway, that's a separate issue. But what is this? If I write this out, there is a slightly fancier way to write it, which we will do, but it's, so what does this mean? You have to bracket it many times, correct? X, x, x. But recall, this is happening in GLV, all those brackets are actual commutators. So if I write out these terms, what will it be like? When I open this out, I will get 2 terms. Then I open it out with the next terms, each one of those will give me 2 more terms. So this will give me 2 to the n terms. What will each one of those terms look like? I will have y, and on one side I will have some x's, and on the other side I will have some x's, correct? Do you see that this does the job? So if x to the 10 were 0 acting on v, then the power of x that will make this work is what will ensure that on one side or the other I have 10 x's. That will be ensured as soon as I take the power, which power? 19th power will work, right? Or 20 if it makes you happy, but there is another way to write this, because note, add x of y is xy minus yx, which is what is the note here? Okay, which is L sub x of y minus R sub x of y. What is that? This is an operator which says take something and multiply it on the left with x, and this is an operator which says multiply something on the right with x. You can do this whenever you have an algebra, right? And these operators commute with each other. The reason why these operators commute with each other is because the algebra is associative, right? When you write x, y, x in whichever fashion you, and what is the algebra that we are talking about here? Not the Lie algebra, but just end V. So since these operators, so this is L sub x. So in other words, the operator add is L sub x minus R sub x. Both of these are nilpotent operators because x to the n itself is 0. And what we have essentially proved is that if you take 2 commuting nilpotent operators, then their sum is also going to be nilpotent, because now you can use if you want to do it formally, we earlier saw, right, 2 to the n terms, but when you take some power of it, because these things commute with each other, I can use the binomial theorem, etc. Okay. So our first theorem we proved. Let's go to the second theorem. So yesterday Raghavan asked you to review Jordan decomposition. Did you? It's going to be a very important tool. Anyway, let's first do Lie's theorem. So the conclusion of the theorem stays the same, in that you can find that given an action, you can find a common eigenvector, but the hypothesis is different. So L is a solvable Lie algebra in some GLV, finite dimensional vector space, implies there exists a common eigenvector for L. Important to assume that F is C, algebraically closed of characteristic 0, or in short C. Do you know an algebraically closed field of characteristic 0 which is not C? There are lots of them. For example, right, so exactly. So they are there, but so it's okay. See, why do we need algebraic closure? That is not such a mystery, right? I want eigenvectors. If I am not able to factor the characteristic polynomial, then what am I going to do? So algebraic closure is okay. But why do I need characteristic 0? That is interesting, and the theorem actually fails in positive characteristic. So proof. And when we have a good thing going, we try to keep it going as long as it will, right? So let's try to imitate this. So what was the idea? I do induction on dimension. By the way, the same thing is, right, I am taking L to be solvable inside GL of V, but I could take it to be an action. It does not really matter. If L is solvable, homomorphic image will also be solvable. So proof, induction on dimension of L. Now here the comment that was made earlier will come into play. So let's try to break this into steps as in the book. So this ideal of codimension 1, I will try to locate 1. Induction gives me for free a common eigenvector of that. Okay. So and then I take the space of common eigenvectors. I try to show that it is stable, and once I show that it is stable, then I am home free, because the extra one I just find an eigenvector of that operator. We will do the same thing. Let us see what is easy and what is hard here. So here perhaps the hardest thing was to find such a thing, but now it is easy. Why? Because L itself is given to be solvable. See, the nature of the hypothesis is different. The Lie algebra is given to be solvable as opposed to individual operators being given to be nilpotent. So since the Lie algebra is solvable, I have 1. So I will write this here. What do I want? I want L K ideal of codimension 1. L is K plus C Z, and then the space of common eigenvectors of K. But there is a little bit to say there, right? So our first thing is to locate this K. Where are we going to locate it? So take this is strictly smaller. So what can I do? I can look at this quotient, and now see, if I find an ideal of codimension 1 here, there is a 1-to-1 correspondence, right? This is one of what will we do without those basic isomorphism theorems. So 1-to-1 correspondence between the ideals of L containing this and the ideals of the quotient. Okay. So if I can find and codimension will stay the same, right, when I pull up. So if I can find a codimension 1 ideal here, then I can simply pull it up. But what sort of thing is this? I have killed all the brackets. I have declared that every bracket is 0. In other words, this Lie algebra is of what kind? It is an abelian Lie algebra. In an abelian Lie algebra, what are the ideals? Every subspace, right? So I can just take a codimension 1 subspace there and add the commutator to it, and I will get an ideal. So from get K from let's get K from a codimension 1 ideal in this abelian Lie algebra. So I have K, and then I will find Z, and so I am set here. Okay. By induction, by the way, K is solvable because because it's a subalgebra of a solvable algebra. Right? So, by induction there exists common eigenvector V such that what? So, I want to write down what this common eigenvector business means. See what is different here. Over there, as soon as I had an eigenvector, I knew what the eigenvalue was. It was always 0, but there is the eigenvalue to keep track of here. So, let us see what the eigenvalues are. Right? So, what I will say is, okay. So, I am generally going to take x in L and y as the general thing in K, and W in here. So, let us take W. It is going to be the space of eigenvectors, but I have just found one so far. So, what will happen if I take any y, if I act on W, then it is going to be some scalar times W, right? But that scalar, that is what it means to be an eigenvector, but that scalar is going to depend on, because remember y varies over all the operators in K. Therefore, the eigenvalue that I get is going to depend on y. So, I should really write lambda y. It is a family of eigenvalues which varies with. So, how is this dependence of the eigenvalue on the eigenvector? Linear. So, what sort of thing is, see, lambda is a function, right? A lambda is a function which takes in an element from the Lie algebra K or ideal K and produces a scalar. So, it is a function on K. What kind of function? It is a linear function, right, because I have a linear action. You see, the way y1 plus y2 acts on W is by taking the sum of the operators by which y1 and y2 acts. Even before I have a Lie, even before it preserving bracket, a Lie algebra, a representation of a Lie algebra has to be first of all a linear map, right. So, therefore, where lambda is in K star, correct, and I should, now I can already make a comment. So, the roots that came today, right, those roots are somehow, they are vectors sitting in some Rn, but how are they going to be related to Lie algebras? They are going to be such, each root is going to be an element of some K star like this, but the K that we will choose will be very different. It will be some Lie subalgebra, but chosen correctly. Here K is solvable, that will actually be look something like this. And when you learn this is something to wrap your mind around. You have to get comfortable with this, that the roots, the vectors, the things that you draw nicely in Euclidean spaces, they are actually linear functionals on some Lie subalgebra. Okay. Now, but back to this situation where lambda is in K star. So what do we do now? See, I was blithely saying the space of all common eigenvectors, but now I will be a little more careful. I will not say take the space of all common eigenvectors, but I will say take the space of all eigenvectors whose eigenvalues are obtained by this linear functional, okay, lambda. So, I will write down this definition. So, W is by definition the space of all those small w in V such that yw is lambda of y times w. So, claim W is stable under what? Under Z. It is already stable under K, right? It is an eigenvector, so it is stable under Z. Okay, okay, I will just say L, because I do not trust myself to depart from my notes even in notation, and I am going to take a general element of x. Once I do this, am I done? Okay. So everything was easy. This is the whole fight. Right. This is the whole fight. So, yeah. And to appreciate this a little bit, let's try to do the case where I have an. Let's go back to the linear algebra situation. So we know that if two operators commute, they have a common eigenvector. This is supposed to be a generalization of that. So just to appreciate what is done and what is left, all the steps that I have done so far, what do those steps? I mean, do those steps give me anything meaningful? If I just have a two-dimensional abelian Lie algebra, do these steps give me anything? So this is nothing, right? This is nothing. Now I am just taking one of the operators. And forget the lambda in K star, because I am just taking two operators, right? Their linear spans, forget it, they commute. So this just says take the eigenvalue, take an eigenspace of one of the operators. Consider that, and it has to be stable. So you see, all those various things that I have done, they really amounted to nothing. The key calculation is yet to be done. Okay. So let's try to do this calculation. Right? So W is stable. So that means I have to take an operator. I have to take a vector W in capital W, and I have to act on it by an arbitrary element x in L. Right. So, E for W in W, x in L implies x dot W is also in L, in W. How do I check that? We are going the same way as over there, right? So how do we do that? How do I check that something is in W? Act by Y. So look at Y, X, W, and I play the same game. It is X, Y, W minus right. Okay. So what does this give? What does this give? This Y acting on W is a multiple of W. In fact, we know which multiple? Lambda Y x W. So this part makes us happy, right? So in order to stay happy, what has to happen? This one has to be, this one really has to be 0, correct? Because recall what the definition of W is, that something acting on a vector should be the lambda of that times the same vector. So that means this must be 0. But what is it? So therefore, it has come down to showing that this linear functional that I have here vanishes on elements of this type. Okay. So let's cheat a little bit, because is there any linear functional on the space of matrices that you know vanishes on the commutator of two operators? Something which is always 0. If you take xy minus minus, something that is always 0. Right. So we need to show that this is the trace of something. Or not we need to, but if we could, wouldn't it be nice? Actually, what we will show is that not that this is the trace of something, but an integer multiple of this is the trace of something. Okay. And now you see where the characteristic 0 assumption comes in. because if I show that n times this number is 0, remember this is happening in the base field, I want to then conclude that the number itself is 0. So, n should be non-zero. So, I will need characteristic 0. So, we will show that lambda y prime is 0. And so, I began at 11:20, right? Okay, fine. So, let us go back and look at this. I am just trying to think if there is a way, one can always pull a rabbit out of the hat. After all, we have Lie to follow, right? But is there a way to motivate this? See, okay, perhaps I should have assigned this yesterday. What is the first non-trivial case of this theorem? Where operators do not commute, but I have a solvable Lie algebra. So, what is the smallest non-trivial solvable Lie algebra? So, there is a two-dimensional one, right? Remember we said that there is this artificial way of constructing by structure constants. So, what is the two-dimensional? So, exercise, check for two-dimensional Lie algebra, which is spanned by let us say x and y. So, I just have to, so in order to give the bracket, all that I have to tell you is, and by definition this is whatever x, y, some linear combination of x, does not really matter. So, maybe you can just spend 5 minutes trying to do this. Try to prove Lie's theorem for this. And in concrete terms, this is only a linear, this is just a linear algebra problem. There are two operators on a vector space, x and y, satisfying the condition that xy minus yx is x. Show that they have a common eigenvector. In the meanwhile, I will put up some stuff so we do not waste the time. Yes, I will try. Okay. Can you also do something? Please do not be shy. If my handwriting becomes, keep telling me. So. Okay, so any success? Of course, the proof that we will do will subsume that, right? But hopefully you can revisit what you tried to do using what we are going to do here. Okay. Oh, unfortunately, I erased that. That's okay. So look, we are starting with W. And we are taking an X, right? So the calculation that we did was Y acting on XW. And that gave some calculation. Can I motivate this in any fashion at all? Okay, anyway, so see this operator X, so W is a special vector that we got, and now I have taken something, some X inside L. So the thing to try to do is, let us look at what X does to W. So it will send it somewhere, but I want to try to find a home in which I can do linear algebra on W. And I have an operator that is in mind, which is X. So what is a natural home where I can do linear algebra related to W and X? I should try to find a space within which this whole thing lives, right? So X is an operator, W is a vector. I'll just try to take the span. I will keep applying X and I will see what I get. Of course, I am going to get something finite dimensional. Remember, this is what we, if you recall the theory of a single linear transformation, this is how we do it, right? When you say what is the minimal polynomial and then you do the structure theory, this is what you do. You take an operator, you think of it as X acting on the vector space, and then it becomes an Fx module, and then you know what the ideals are and what the module theory is. This is how you go ahead and do it, and we will revisit that when we do Jordan decomposition. So let's look at this space W, XW, x to the I minus 1 W. Let's call this, following the book, W sub I. So I am going to get W0, which is contained in W1, which is contained in W2, and then at some point it will not grow, right? At some point it will, at some point what will happen is that a further application of X will be a span of whatever is before. So stop at the first place. Okay. So Wn, which is the maximum. So what does this mean? That, in other words, what this says is that the minimal polynomial of W is of degree of X on this space. Well, is it the minimal polynomial? Just be careful. Yes, because W is killed only by a polynomial of degree. Right? So if you look at this space W sub n as a representation of C polynomial ring Cx, what is it? It is Cx modulo a polynomial of degree n, right? So this is the space in which I am going to do linear algebra. Okay. And I have an increasing chain of subspaces. So is this clear? See, the setting is the thing that is more important. So what I will do is I will look at, so W is there, X is there. Now I will see how a general Y acts on this space. Okay. So let's look. So Y times W, I already know what that is lambda Y. Correct? So I am going to try to build the matrix of Y on this. We will see in fact that this is stable under Y, and let us see what the matrix is going to be. So this is W, XW up to x to the n minus 1 W. Those are the basis vectors, right? By design. The next one becomes dependent on these, and then of course all the further ones are going to be dependent on this. So this is, so I am going to try to build the matrix. So what does this say? The matrix of Y. So matrix of y on Wn. So what does this say? This simply says that the first column is lambda y and then all the zeros. Let us see what happens when we go next. Y on xw. This is exactly the type of calculation that we have been doing, right? So we already have the answer here. What does it say? What will be the matrix? So then I will not write the zeros. So how will the second column be? Over here I will get lambda of y prime something. I don't really care actually, but I will write down lambda of y prime, and here I will get lambda y and then zeros. Just one more calculation and then the picture will be absolutely clear. This part we don't need anymore. So just try to do this calculation, see what happens. The next one, it will become a little messy, but then we will extract what it is that we are trying to prove, and that will not be hard. So I have to then check what happens when I apply y to x square w. Okay, so I have to keep pushing it forward, right? But this is okay. So this is going to be x on y x w, and then so basically I am thinking of so this is y x x w. The x w I am going to keep the same, and then minus bracket of x y with x w. Is this okay? This is just a straightforward calculation, I think. This is correct, no? Yes? Okay. So then what do we do? But this is looking good. So let's look here. This is x acting on y x w. Well, I know what y x w is. This is going to be lambda y. So I am trying to skip some steps. So just please make sure that when x applies to the first term, it will just go away. So I will get x square acting on w, and this is the only term that I am interested in. Okay. But let us see what the rest is to get the induction going. Then there will be another term, which is what? X acting on this. So minus lambda y prime x w. Then minus this is y prime, by the way. So y prime acting on x w. So this term is, I have to do the calculation separately, y prime acting on x w. But notice y prime is just another y. So I can again refer to the same calculation. So what is that? Y prime acting on x w is lambda y prime on x w, and now my notation fails me unless I can put a double prime or something like that. Okay. But at this point I don't care. What I say is scalar times w. Is this okay? So what will it look like? I will get hopefully lambda y here, and then something here and something here, and again lower down I have zeros. Okay. So what do I want to say? That the matrix of y on this space, first of all, this space is stable, and the matrix of y on this space is upper triangular. Even that is not important, but the point is that all the diagonal entries are lambda of y. This is for an arbitrary y. Okay. So check by induction. You see how this is going to go, right? The calculation is going to proceed in the same fashion. What you will have is that, okay, so this is bad, but might as well. So y acting on x to the I w. So what will change over here? Let's just do it, at least sketch it. So what will happen? I will peel off one of the x's, so I will get x times y x to the I minus 1 w minus bracket of x y on but this is good, no? Already the induction is done, you see, because this bracket of x and y is just another y. right? Notice that the space that I have defined here, this W, it does not depend on y. It depends only on the operator x that I have fixed and the eigenvector W. So this guy is okay, because I know that by induction this one is a linear combination of x to the I minus 1 W and lower thing. So I am just attaching another x, so everything will go up by 1, but I know what the diagonal term is. And here I don't even have to worry about it, because this is x to the I minus 1 W. So all the terms that will come from here will be x to the I minus 1 W and lower. So they will not contribute. Okay. So in fact check by induction that matrix, and when I reach up to n there will be nothing, you see, because a term will just die. Check that the matrix of y on Wn is upper triangular with lambda y on the diagonal. This finishes the proof. Why? Notice, it is not the matrix of y that I am interested in finally. It is the matrix of y prime, which was the bracket of x and y, because I want to find out about lambda of that. So what did I say? The bracket of, the matrix of y is upper triangular with lambda y on the diagonal. So trace of y acting on Wn is, it's a diagonal matrix with all the same entries lambda y, and it's n dimensional. So the trace is going to be n times lambda y. When I take y prime, which is the bracket of x and y, I will get n times lambda of y prime. But being the trace of a bracket, it is 0. Therefore, n times lambda of y prime is 0, and therefore lambda of y prime is 0. Okay. So fantastic result. And in positive characteristics it fails. So let's mop up the corollaries. Okay, I can maybe take 3 more minutes. Is this all right? This is just like before, right? When I used Engel's theorem to get matrices of an action strictly upper triangular, I do the exact same thing over here. I find one eigenvector, then I go modulo that, then I find eigenvector for the resulting action, and so on. So that will make all the matrices in upper triangular form. Notice that, L doesn't really have to sit inside GLV, it can be an action, and then you just apply the theorem to the homomorphic copy. So is this okay? So it says that if L is solvable, then it has a chain of ideals of dimension increasing by 1. So where is this coming from? This is really the same theorem. What is V? V is L, the action is add. And if something is stable under add, then what does that mean? So that's how you get this one. This last one requires a little bit of, see, this is again going to connect up. So if L is solvable, then the add action of x in the derived one is nilpotent. So let's think about that for a moment, but I want you to see that the next part where that comes from. So forget the first line. Suppose the add action of x in the derived algebra on L is nilpotent. So some action of this Lie algebra is nilpotent. But what does that mean? I can apply now Engel's theorem that all the operators in this are acting nilpotently on this vector space. In particular, they will act nilpotently on itself also, right, which is a part of L. And so what does this say? By Engel's theorem, that this Lie algebra will be nilpotent. Okay. So we have this, that if L is solvable, then the bracket of L with itself is nilpotent. This should not come as a surprise. See, if L is a linear Lie algebra and it is solvable, then what does this first theorem say? that I can make L itself upper triangular. So if I have something which is sitting inside upper triangular matrices, and if I take its bracket with itself, our basic calculation shows that it goes one further up, which is nilpotent, right. So, and we also know that every Lie algebra is linear, even though it is a hard theorem. So this is not surprising, but we can do it without using that hard result. So if L is solvable, then add action of X is nilpotent. Why is that? Because the add action of L on itself is upper triangular. Every X, if you write L itself with respect to this add action and then make it upper triangular, then all matrices of L acting on L are upper triangular matrices. So when you take the bracket of two such matrices, it is automatically going by the same calculation. By the same calculation, it will become strictly upper triangular, and so the action will be nilpotent. So there is nothing much to this. How about this one? We are going to need this. So, and I am really out of time. So are you okay with this? Let us see where this comes from. Has everybody at least seen the the actual honest Jordan canonical form of a matrix? Yes. So let us write that down. So how does the Jordan canonical form of a matrix look like? The part itself splits within various blocks. So, and each block is of this kind, lambda, lambda, since this is a block. So in this description, what is X sub S and what is X sub N? What is the semi-simple part and what is the nilpotent part? You just take the diagonal and you take whatever is left over. Right? So it is clear that the diagonal part is it is diagonal. Is it clear that the other thing is nilpotent? Yes, it is clear. Is it clear that they commute? Yes, it is clear here because the matrix splits into block form. So you have to check it only on each block, and on each block the semi-simple part is actually just a scalar matrix. So here it is okay, but what is not okay is that X sub S and X sub N are polynomials in your original operator. You sort of need to prove that in order to prove uniqueness. Okay. So how do you get this? Let me just ask you one question and stop. If X looks like this, then what is V as an Fx module? So if you have, so here there will be, it will be of the type V is isomorphic to Fx modulo x minus lambda to the some power, and this power will be the size of that block. So you will have 3 lambda terms, then as many mu terms as many are the blocks of mu, and so on and so forth. If that is the case, what is the basis? So let me just make it 4 lambda lambda. For this block, what is the basis in which the matrix looks like this of the operator X? The operator X on this module just acts by left multiplication, right? So what is the basis? 1 X, right? So all of this really should be, you should feel some degree of comfort with this. Okay. You see in today's lecture that linear algebra is something that you do every step of the way. So let's stop here. Please try to prove the Jordan decomposition for yourself. So we will begin at 2 o'clock.